For today, we're going to be going over chapter 14, which is how biological diversity evolves. So we're really going to be looking at macroevolution. Now, based off macroevolution, we're able to create new species in the evolutionary history of life. Okay, so with that idea, let's talk about what is macroevolution. So macroevolution is major changes in the history of life, evolutionary change at or above the species level. So when we were looking in the last chapter, we were looking at all the small little things that create evolution or has natural selection act on different traits in different species to favor or diminish certain traits. So what we're going to see in this chapter is how do we go further than that? How do we have, a single cellular organism then become hundreds of thousands of different types of organisms that we find in species in this world? All right, so with that, we have to understand what speciation is. Speciation is when one species evolves into two or more species, so the formation of different species. And then lastly, we need to know, okay, then what is a species? So a species is a group of organisms which are capable of interbreeding and having viable and fertile offspring. So the important parts of this is that this is a group of organisms, all right? Sometimes we call them a population. And they are capable of interbreeding, so they have to be able to have offspring, and that offspring has to be viable and fertile. All right, so viable means that they're able to live, right? They're able to actually go out and they're actually be able to get their food, find their shelter, find their water, all that kind of stuff. That's viable. Fertile is they have to be able to have kids of their own. So if you create offspring that are infertile, they're not able to have kids of their own, well, that doesn't mean those organisms together aren't a species, because what ends up happening is you can never propagate that species. It's going to die out after that next generation. All right, so once again, that's extremely important that we have a group of organisms or a population which are capable of interbreeding and having viable and fertile offspring. All right, so we actually call this definition the biological species definition. All right, so the biological species definition. And the reason for that, why we call the biological species definition, is this actually doesn't fit all of life. This definition of being able to interbreed and having viable and fertile offspring, we can't fit all of life into that definition of a species. So we just call this the biological species definition. And so you're thinking, well, why doesn't it fit everybody in that is considered living? Well, first of all, we've already talked about in the past that there's asexual species, right? So asexual species like bacteria, even some type of plants, and even some types of lizards are asexual, which means they don't engage in sexual reproduction, which definitely then would rule them out of this species, biological species definition, because they're not going to be interbreeding. If they're not interbreeding, then how do we know if they're a species? So that's one way the biological species definition doesn't fit every known living organism. The other is our extinct species, right? So we can't go back and look at dinosaurs and say, oh yes, this T-Rex was mating with this T-Rex and created this offspring. We just assume that that's what they were doing, but unless we had a time machine to go back and actually look at it, we don't really know that that's what really happened. And so really this biological species definition doesn't work for asexual organisms and extinct. And so what there are other species definitions. So they're not all biological species definition, sometimes also called the biological species concept, but there's others. So another one is kind of phenotype or physical traits. All right, we use this one a lot of the time for our extinct species, right? So we can look and say, okay, this looks like a T-Rex, this looks like a T-Rex, looks like there's a lot of these fossils that look like T-Rexes, so we're gonna create this, the Tyrannosaurus Rex species. And even this is only as good as what we can see, because some people out there think that, let's say, take Triceratops, for example. So Triceratops has the 3 horns, and they found these other fossils that look like baby Triceratops, where maybe they don't have horns yet, they only have the 1 horn on their nose. And some paleontologists say that, oh, these are just babies of Triceratops. While other paleontologists think, no, these are just a smaller form of that type of a dinosaur. So they're actually a different species. So we see these a lot with, like, let's say kangaroos. There's kangaroos and there's wallabies. Wallabies are very smaller looking type of kangaroos, but they're different species. They don't interbreed and have viable and fertile offspring. But you can imagine if they went extinct and we had no history of kangaroos and wallabies when they were alive, and we were just looking at their fossils, that some might think, oh no, these are just baby kangaroos, and instead of different species. And so the physical traits concept, it's all we can use for extinct species, but it still doesn't make it really defined. That's why this biological species one is better. Now, what about for those asexual organisms? Well, what we usually use for them are a couple of different ones. So we have like ecological niches. So a niche or niche is like a certain thing, like a job of a species. And so like with bacteria, there's different bacteria that break down different forms of organic material. And so based on what form of organic material that they do, you can create, you can break things off into different species. So that's our ecological niche. We also have the biggest one that's coming into play now is the DNA concept. So this one's used the most with our asexual organisms. Is they look at how similar the DNA is of these types of organisms. So this is used quite a bit actually in our bacteria. So bacteria, what we do is we say if there's a certain amount of gene differences or DNA differences between this bacterium and this bacterium, then we're going to count them as different species. So these are different ways in which we can apply this idea of species, not just on our interbreeding and having fertile and vital offspring, but also using ecological niches, their physical appearances, their DNA, how much of it is overlapping, how much is similar, how much is different. All of that can be utilized to help us understand and know what are species and what aren't species. And then as things evolve away from each other, it makes it easier for us to understand how evolution is currently happening recently and in our lives today, and almost trying, not necessarily predict, but kind of find different pathways in which evolution might occur in the future as well. For the most part though, we're going to focus on our biological species concept. We're going to be talking about how do these major changes in Earth history, when we look at all these different species, come about using specifically our biological species concept, just because for the majority of our larger organisms that we see, they participate in sexual reproduction, and so this is actually a good definition for them. So we're going to see two different pathways in which this occurs. When we're talking about speciation, we have two different things that we mainly talk about, two different pathways. So the first one is our reproductive barriers, and we actually have two types of reproductive barriers. And then we have our mechanisms of speciation, which have our two types with the allopatric and sympatric. So first we're going to focus in on our two types of reproductive barriers. So our two types are prezygotic barriers. So this is before fertilization. So in other words, this is stopping a male and a female of one species and allowing their gametes to come together, their eggs and their sperm. So when eggs and sperm come together, that's fertilization. So these are barriers before fertilization can actually even occur. And then we have our postzygotic barriers, and these are barriers after fertilization, right? So here our egg and our sperm were able to come together, but still there was barriers that didn't allow them to become viable and fertile offspring like we saw in our definition. All right, so let's first talk about our prezygotic barriers. So our first one, this could be like temporal isolation. So temporal isolation is talking about like time or seasons. So you could have a situation where there are two different types of field mice, right? And one set of the field mice only mates in the spring and the other set only mates in the fall. So even though they're living in the same area, they're interacting with each other, but because they only become sexually active during these different mating seasons, they're going to create a barrier amongst them where one's only going to be mating in the fall and the other one's only going to be mating in the spring. And so because of that prezygotic barrier, they are different species of field mice. Another way you could look at this is maybe different types of animals, those that are nocturnal and those that are diurnal. So nocturnal, as you probably know, means active at night, but those that are diurnal means that they're active in the day. So if you have two very similar species of bird, and say one species of bird is like an owl, is nocturnal, it only is up and about and active at night, and then you have another similar bird of prey, like a hawk, that's only active and about during the day. Well, they have been temporally separated because when they are out and active is when the other one is asleep, and therefore they're not going to interact with each other specifically to interbreed and create offspring. So that's our temporal isolation. Our next one here is our habitat isolation. All right, so let's give you a couple examples of this. Habitat isolation, let's say you have two different types of squirrels. You have a ground squirrel and a tree squirrel. Well, the ground squirrel's habitat is obviously the ground, and the tree squirrel's habitat is the tree. And because of that, they have different habitats that they spend their time in differently from each other or separate from each other. And therefore, because of that, the chances of them interacting and then even going further than that and breeding becomes less because of the habitat they're in. You could also look at this with like a lake. In a lake, you have a shallow part of the lake and you have a more of a deep end part of the lake. Now, if you have some fish that like to stay near the shallow end because maybe they feed more on like the insects and stuff like that found in that area, and then you have like maybe these bigger fish or other fish that are more in the deep end that feed off the food that's found in that different area. So even though they're in the same lake, because of their habitat, whether it's the shallow part or the deep part, they're not going to interact with each other. Therefore, they have a habitat isolation stopping them from actually interbreeding. All right, our next one is behavioral isolation. So we talked a little bit about this when we looked at sexual selection. In sexual selection, we found that there's a lot of birds that you have this female choice, right? So that behavior is, okay, here's this female peafowl, so the peahen, and it's watching the dance of a peacock with its tail feathers. That behavior is going to isolate them from maybe another bird species doing a different dance. So we've actually seen this a lot in Indonesia. There's a lot of different species of birds that all stem from one original species. And what happens is you get all of a sudden these females are start to like different traits. So before they liked it that it danced hopping up and down. And then all of a sudden another male started dancing while flapping its wings up and down. And one group of females liked the wings up and down, the other group liked the hopping up and down. And because of those different behavioral differences, they decided they're only going to interbreed with those that are doing this specific dance. And so there's this whole group, like I said, in Indonesia of these small birds that all have these different dances that they do and different songs that they sing, all based on the females now having a different thing that they're more attracted to and want to create and mate, interbreed and mate and create offspring with that male. And so behavioral isolation, like I said, is really big inside the bird population. Our next is mechanical isolation. So this is the whole idea that the plug doesn't fit in the socket, right? If you are too big of an animal and too small of an animal, the chances of them being able to actually interbreed because of physical incapabilities, that is our mechanical isolation, right? So we know that all dogs are the same species. We just have different types of dogs. But kind of get this idea of a little Chihuahua that's only about this big, and then a Great Dane that can stand, nearly the height as me, and trying to see them interbreed in the wild, they wouldn't be able to do that. Well, we can do that, and that's how we have all these different forms of dogs, is because as humans, we've been able to pull out different traits and how our selective breeding practices. But if we were to allow all dogs all of a sudden to go wild, you would actually probably see these different type of breeds come together, and those that can have interbreeding with because of they're able to mechanically, and those that can't, and you probably end up seeing a bunch of different species of dogs after hundreds of years, just based off this idea that some of the dogs could interbreed and others couldn't because of the differences mechanically there in their sex organs. All right, so let's say we get over all these barriers and we get to inject the sperm into the female. Well, then there could also be gametic isolation. And this is the idea that the egg and the sperm still won't combine together because on the egg there are certain receptors, and those receptors have to match the receptors that are on the sperm. And so we can do this like we talked earlier in our last chapter, how chimpanzees and gorillas are very closely related. They share 97% of their genome. Yet if you were to take the sperm of a chimpanzee and egg of a gorilla and put them together, there was this gametic isolation. You still can't even get them to come together. Even if they are trying to breed, that fertilization still doesn't occur. All right, and even if you do it vice versa, the sperm of a gorilla and the egg of a chimpanzee, it still doesn't happen because they don't have the right receptors on each other's gametes so that they can come together to create fertilization. All right, so once again, that is all of our pre-zygotic barriers. Those are our 5 examples of that. Next, we're going to be looking at our post-zygotic barriers. So this is after fertilization. So let's say they get over all these barriers and they're actually be able to have fertilization, but there still is a chance that they couldn't be a species. So one thing, reduced hybrid viability. So we'll see this where we get fertilization, but either the fetus never comes to a full term, so it's aborted, or when it's born, it dies shortly thereafter, or has some type of deformity which doesn't allow it to live, to go out and hunt or gather its food or graze or whatever type of species it is. And so its viability is reduced. It's not able to actually live long enough to get to sexual maturity to also be able to interbreed or to breed. So that's one. So reduced hybrid viability. Another one is our reduced hybrid fertility. So this is where you get through all these different barriers, and you have a nice, healthy infant. It can grow to sexual maturity, but guess what? Once it gets to sexual maturity, it's infertile, right? Reduced hybrid fertility, it's actually infertile, it's sterile, it can't actually have children. And so we see this with things like having a horse and a mule come together to create a donkey, right? So donkeys are actually hybrids of a horse and a mule, but they're infertile, so that's how we know that horses and mules are actually separate species. We see this with lions and tigers. If you have a lion and tiger come together, we create the liger, right? This huge animal. It's bigger than both a lion and a tiger. You should search it on the internet if you haven't seen it before. They're pretty big, huge cat, but infertile, sterile, unable to have children. So we know that lions and tigers are different species because of that. And there's a bunch of different other things like this. So you could search up hybrid species. Now, some of them are going to be fake, so don't get freaked out by some of them. But then there's some like the zorse, so a horse and a zebra, they create a zorse, or a molar bear, so a grizzly and a polar bear that come together. There's, I'm trying to think of some other ones. But yeah, so there's some very unique hybrids that can be very viable, that can grow up, be able to survive, but at the end of the day, they're infertile and they're unable to actually create offspring. All right, so those are our two types of reproductive barriers, our prezygotic and postzygotic. Now we're going to be looking at the mechanisms of speciation. Our two forms of mechanism of speciation are allopatric, which is a geographic barrier that physically isolates a population, and sympatric, and that's the origin of a new species without a geographic barrier. So let's talk first about our allopatric. So I always remember allopatric apart, so AA. We're going to end up separating populations apart from each other through geographic barriers. So one good example of this is like a mountain range. All right, let me get rid of this here so I have room to draw. All right, so here's our western United States. This is my very bad drawing. Obviously, we have Utah here, Arizona, Nevada, and California. So there's this big mountain range that separates Nevada and California, and it's right here. It's called the Sierra Nevada Mountain Range. And what happens is, because of how our weather patterns happen in the US, the majority of our clouds come from the West Coast and they head east. And so as these clouds come across, they're going to hit this mountain range. And when the clouds hit this mountain range, they actually have to go up higher. And if you know anything about clouds, when they go up higher, it gets colder, so they condense, and then they begin to rain. Right? And so by the time they get up and over these mountains, there's not very much rain left in these clouds. And what we see because of that is Nevada and Utah are, I think Utah is third, and I think Nevada is the second driest state. It might be the first driest state in all of the United States of America. And all because of the Sierra Nevada mountains, they stop majority of rain being able to come in off the coast to come into Nevada and Utah. And that's why specifically in Nevada you see very big deserts here. Utah, the same, that's very dry desert area. I mean, right here you have the Bonneville Salt Flats, which is like just completely flat salt. And then this is all kind of deserty. But on the other side here in California, we have what we call like places like Napa Valley, right? And places like that. And what do? They grow a bunch of grapes and fruits and food and all that kind of stuff because they get all of this water. So this has a lot of different types of species in it that can grow and you know, very, very wet, very green in this area compared to Nevada and Utah on the other side. And so you're probably wondering, what does any of this have to do with allopatric speciation? Well, before there was this mountain range here, this all was kind of similar land. But as this mountain range became up because of tectonic plates, you had species that lived in the California end and the Nevada and Utah end, and they all were very similar species. But the minute you created this geographic barrier, one thing you did is you created a barrier or isolation, right? So they're no longer able to interbreed. But on top of that, you've also created two different types of environments. You have a very wet environment here, and you have a very dry environment here. So the species that you find in the dry environment, if you were to put them in the wet environment, probably would die because they're not adapted to it. Same with the species that are in this wet dry environment. If you put them in this dry, they would also die because they're not adapted to it. Because over hundreds of thousands and even millions of years, because these mountains took a long time to build up, you had all these different environmental changes or these natural selection possibilities happening on the same population before those mountains were there to create different populations of these organisms. And so that's how allopatric speciation works, is you physically separate those species so they can no longer interbreed and be able to create offspring. And as you separate them, most likely you're going to also have different environmental factors or natural selection now selecting for different traits on them based off the new environment that they find themselves in. And that's how you get allopatric speciation. So besides mountain ranges, we see this with canyons. So here, nope, that comes down right there. So here's the Colorado River, right? So it drains the mountains like of the Uintas in northern Utah, and then the mountains from the Rocky Mountains over in Colorado. And so it's a pretty good sized river. And as we know, this part right here is our Grand Canyon, right? So it has cut this huge gorge or canyon into the regular, mountain and land that was there. And so you've created a big barrier between species that used to live on the north part of the Grand Canyon and species that lived on the south part of the Grand Canyon. So once again, cutting that canyon took thousands and millions of years, but before that canyon was there, so there's a lot of different places where there's a river and you can just walk right over the river or go over to the river. Well, you can't really do that with the Grand Canyon now. And so as this canyon got deeper and deeper, it started separating species on the north end and the south end of the Grand Canyon. And specifically, there's a squirrel species that's called North End Grand Canyon squirrel species and South End Grand Canyon squirrel species. They're very similar. They look somewhat similar. There are a bit of physical differences, but they're different species because one's on one end and one's on the other. And actually, if you have a chance to go to the Grand Canyon, you'll notice that the north part of the Grand Canyon is higher elevated. It's got it snows there and all that other kind of stuff. And on the south end of the Grand Canyon, you don't have as much of that. So you have, once again, it's more deserty. So once again, you have different environments that has separated this population of squirrel, one above the Grand Canyon and one below the Grand Canyon. And now because of that, they become different species and they have different adaptations because their environments are different. Natural selection is selecting on their different traits differently because of that. And you create new species. All right, so this could also happen with things like land bridges. So if we draw another pretty picture here. You guys are lucky you're seeing all this online. Most of my tests, I have you guys draw pictures, so you guys haven't had that opportunity. All right, so we have, this is a bad picture. North America and South America. And right here in the middle, you have Panama. And there's a strip of land, I can't remember how many miles wide it is, but it's actually very thin, that separates our Atlantic and Pacific oceans. Now, this little stretch of land hasn't always been here. Before before the last ice age, so even before that, when the environment in our world was a lot warmer, our polar ice caps weren't as concentrated with ice, and our sea levels were much higher. And because of that, this part of Central America, Panama, maybe a little bit of Honduras, no, maybe not so much Honduras, but Costa Rica, those different areas were actually underwater. And the Pacific and the Atlantic were able to move in and out. Well, what happens as the ice age came in and we start to create more of our ocean water into ice, then our land bridge came here and we now separated, we created a barrier between the different species of fish, mammals, all that lived in the Pacific and Atlantic Ocean. And due to that, now you have different environmental factors happening to the fish on the Pacific side and different environmental factors happening to the fish and other animals and other plants and other organisms, not just fish, on the other side. And because of that, over thousands and millions of years, they're having these different environmental cues, and natural selection is acting on these species different. So it used to be one population, now could turn into multiple populations. All right, this could also be done through the creation of islands. So here we have our Galapagos Islands that are just off the west coast of South America. And what has happened is as these islands grew up out of the ocean, you then started having species of like birds that came over to these islands from South America. You also had different species come on what we call vegetation rafts. So these are huge rafts of vegetation, and tortoises and iguanas got on these rafts of vegetation and ended up making their way over to these islands. And what Darwin specifically saw is that the animals that were all at the Galapagos Islands were very similar to animals over in South America, in this area of South America. But what he ended up finding out is that they had different types of adaptations and they were different species. So specifically in the Galapagos Islands, we have these marine iguanas. So there's plenty of places on the islands where there's not very much greenery for iguanas to be able to eat. And so instead they actually eat algae. And because of this, they will dive down into the ocean and start eating algae that's on the rocks and whatnot, and that's their diet. Well, that diet has a lot of salt in it, and so these have these little glands where they actually shoot snot that is full of salt out of their system so they can get rid of all the salt, because if they have too much salt in their system, it's bad. And so these are the only marine iguanas in the world, but they're very similarly related to the iguanas found in South America, but because they had to get their food that was high salt content because it was in the ocean, they evolved to have these glands to be able to excrete and get rid of that salt. And so now there are different species of iguana. All right, so these are all different types of allopatric speciation and how animals go from one population, and because of that, they're able to go to different populations and different species. And eventually, as these things happen over thousands and millions of years, you see different forms of species that can come about. And you can have them diverge from each other after many, many years and have different types of adaptations, different types of things that have allowed them to evolve to the environment that they are currently in. All right, last is our sympatric speciation. So this is the origin of new species without geographic barriers. So a lot of what we saw in our pre-zygotic and post-zygotic things can be done here, right? So you could have two different birds living in the same jungle, but because one is dancing this way and the other one's dancing this way, now they're going to be different species because the females are picking which way they want to dance. Or you could have two different types of birds, one that is nocturnal, one that's diurnal, and even though they're living in the same area, there's no geographic barrier, there's that other type of barrier. So a lot of those pre-zygotic and post-zygotic barriers actually fit into this idea of sympatric speciation. So once again, sympatric speciation, similar, so they live in a similar area. Allopatric speciation, allopatric, apart, they'll be torn apart by a physical geographic barrier. That's how I always, when I was in high school, not high school, but in college, remember the difference between allopatric and sympatric speciation. All right, so for the last part of our chapter, now we know all about species and how they have evolved away from each other and the different types of mechanisms. We need to look at how do we now label and label different species, and we're going to be talking about the Linnaeus system for doing that. When we talk about different species, it's fine to often use like the common name for them, like a lion or a deer or a human. But by using what we call our scientific name for them, we can better understand where they actually fall, not only in the type of species that they are, but in the evolutionary aspect of that species as well. And so in the early 1700s, we had a scientist called Carolus Linnaeus that created a naming system for all of life. Now, we still use this naming system, even though it's a bit archaic, it's a bit old, but some of the basic concepts of it are beneficial, and we've had to change things up a little bit as we've learned more since the 1700s about different organisms and how they're related to each other and everything like that. But this system, which we call the Linnaeus system of classification, goes, and I'm sure have heard this before: kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, species. So we can classify what type of species we're talking about and how related they are to other species based off if they have the same kingdom, the same phylum, class, order, family, the same genus, and then if they have, and then genus species is what we call our binomial, which we'll talk about here in a bit, specifically tells us what singular species we're talking about. But let's start here at the top. So in the kingdom, this idea is that every one of our living organisms are put into one of 6 kingdoms. Now, our kingdoms have been changed over the years, but right now we have 6 kingdoms, and there's a chance that those could be made into more or less in the future, but for right now we have 6 kingdoms. So what are our 6 kingdoms? We have bacteria, we have archaea, we have protista, we have animalia, we have plantae, and lastly, fungi. So those are our 6 kingdoms. In other words, I can go out and grab any living organism in the world, and I would be able to put it in one of these 6 kingdoms. If I went and got an animal, if I got a cat, it falls under animal. If I went and grabbed a flower, it's a plant. It falls under plantae. If I am looking at E. coli, it's a bacteria. If I'm looking at algae, it's a protista, right? If I grab a mushroom, that's a fungi. Any type of living organism out there, I can grab it and it fits into one of these 6 categories. And what we do is, so we have just these 6 categories, then when we go to phylum, we start to break these categories up into different phylum. So now there are, I don't know the exact number, but maybe there's 50 different phylum. There's actually probably a lot more than that. And some of them are under bacteria, some of them are under archaea, protista, animalia, plantae, fungi. Then each one of those phylum will have different classes underneath them. So I could take one of those phylum and say there are 15 classes underneath them, right? And it just keeps going. So here we have a small number, then we're gonna have a bigger number, bigger number, bigger number, then smaller number, and then it's gonna be a singular organism, a singular species, right? So it goes small, big, big, small again. And when you're looking at how many different are in each one of those. All right, so recently we've added another form, another order, or not order, another category in our Carlos Linnaeus classification system. And that one is at the very top. We call it domain. And this idea is that there are 3 separate types of cells out there that make up all of life. And so those 3 separate types of cell is that there's bacteria cells, there's archaean cells, and there are eukaryotic. Or what we're going to do here is let's say eukarya. And so these 4 right here all fall under eukarya. Archaeans fall under archaean, and bacteria fall under bacteria. So once again, we can say all of life fits into one of these 3 categories. So if I grab a plant, it's an archaea. If I grab an animal, it's an archaea. If I go to grab algae, it's an archaea. If I grab a mushroom, it's an archaea. If I grab a E. coli, that's a bacteria. If I grab a thermophile, that's an archaean. All right, so all of life. So this is something we just recently came up with. So about the early, either late 90s, early 2000s, that we've added on to this Carlos Linnaeus classification system. All right, so we're not going to dig too very much deep into phylum, class, order, and family. So really, I want you to know the domain and kingdoms, and then I want you to know the idea of what we call our binomial. So binomial means tuning. And this is how we create the scientific species name of a species. So if we want to say, what's the scientific species of humans? You're all now shouting at your computer to me, Homo sapien, right? Homo sapiens. So our genus is Homo, and our species is sapiens. So when we say them together, we are Homo sapiens. If I can spell this right. Homo sapiens. That's what our scientific name for our species is, Homo sapiens. We can do this differently. Let's say for a lion. A lion would be Panthera leo. So its genus is Panthera, its species is Leo. If we were looking at a tiger, it would be Panthera tigris. That's the species, the scientific name for a tiger. Now, when we're creating scientific names, there's two things that have to happen. The scientific name has to be in Latin. The genus has to be capitalized. The species has to be lowercase. And then the whole thing has to be written in italics. That's how you properly write the binomial of a species. So I say, we're humans, we are Homo sapiens, and if I write that out, I capitalize the H for Homo because that's our genus. I lowercase the sapiens because that's our species. And this is in Latin. Homo means man, sapiens means free thinking. So together we are free thinking man. And then italics, it's hard to write on a whiteboard in italics, but if you see it in print, this will be italicized. And so there's going to be a question on your test that is specifically about, I'm going to ask you, what is the scientific name of an animal? And you're not going to know, but you're going to be able to guess because of these 4 rules when we're creating the binomial or the scientific name. They have to follow these 4 rules. Has to be in Latin, has to be capitalized on the genus, lowercase on the species, and it has to be italicized. If it doesn't have all those 4 things, then that's not the right scientific name for a species. All right, so we do still use this quite a bit in biology, but we're in the process of getting away more and more from this, mainly because of genetics. We'll probably continue to always use this specifically for our genus and species and that binomial, but when it comes to genetics, we start now classifying things or grouping things based off what we call cladistics. And cladistics is pretty much making what we call clades of the history of a species or of a group of animals. So we could do a single species, or we could do like maybe a family or something like that to kind of figure out what's the evolutionary path of that. And so we're going to do cladistics of mammals. All right, so the evolutionary history of mammals. So we're going to make a cladistic. And these kind of look like family trees because that's the idea, is we're trying to show where they have originated from. So in mammals, we have 3 different types of mammals. We have what we call our eutherians, we have our marsupials, and we have our monotrims. All right, and all of them stem from a single common ancestor. And so this part here is going to be our common ancestor, and that common ancestor is going to be a reptile. All right, and so we're just going to pick a reptile. So I'm going to say, let's just going to say a lizard. All right, so that starts here. So this is our common ancestor. So we're saying that all of these organisms evolved from reptiles. And we know this through our evolutionary history and looking at the fossil history and looking at the genetics. We know that mammals came and evolved from reptiles. All right, so our most oldest type of mammal we're going to place here. And that first type of animal is what we call monotremes. And one of these mammals is called a platypus. We call these monotremes. All right, so our platypus is mammals that still lay eggs, right? We know reptiles, how they have babies is they lay eggs. Most mammals don't, except for our monotremes. They still lay eggs. So you're probably wondering, wait, I thought mammals, the reason why mammals are mammals is because they don't lay eggs. No, the thing that makes mammals mammals are two things: that they have hair on their body and that they feed their young milk. So they have mammary glands. That's where the word mammal comes from, is mammary glands. And so platypus, they have hair, as you've probably seen them. The duck-billed platypus is what they call it. And it has, and it also has mammary glands to feed its young milk. All right, so a platypus is still a mammal. It's just a specific type of mammal called a monotreme. All right, so now what we're saying here is right here, there's some ancestral mammal that gave rise to platypus, but also gave rise to our next two forms of mammals. And one of them is going to be our, we'll say, kangaroo. And these are our marsupials. So how are marsupials different from our monotremes? So marsupials have a pouch. So we've talked a little bit about this, in that they don't do full gestation, which means, so they grow their fetus inside of the uterus, but it only gets to maybe about this big. Then it leaves the uterus and migrates to the pouch. And in the pouch is where you find the mammary glands or the nipples for the kangaroo or the koala or the wombat or the Tasmanian devil or whatever other type of marsupial there is. So they go live in that pouch, and then they start eating milk at a very young age until they develop inside that pouch. But when they leave the uterus, they're this small little naked rat-looking type of animal, and it develops fully inside the pouch of its mother. And so here we have the formation. So here we have the formation of mammary glands. And we could say hair. Here we have the formation of pouch. I shouldn't say pouch. Here we have the formation of gestation, so the uterus. And so you only do partial gestation for the kangaroo. Then if we look here, let's say a lion. So a lion, these are part of our eutherians. So our eutherians are the mammals that you think of, majority of mammals. They do full gestation, so when the baby is born, it is fully developed and is able to go on and live. So here, our platypus, and they don't have the uterus, so they have a uterus here, but it's only partially used by our kangaroos. And then our lions and other eutherians, they don't have pouches. They do full gestation inside the uterus. And this clade shows the evolutionary history of mammals, saying mammals all stemmed as lizards. Our oldest form of mammals were like lizards because they still laid eggs, but they were different because they had mammary glands and hair. Well, then we had mammals that developed from our platypus and our echidna. That's the other type of, there's only two types of, well, there's two different species of echidnas. So there's 3 different species of monotremes. But those other monotremes eventually evolved into our marsupials. So marsupials had a uterus and started doing partial gestation, and then allowed for the pouches to come about, and then they would have that milk inside the pouches. And then you had a bunch of these marsupials that then evolved into our eutherians, so all of our different types of mammals we see today. And so we know that these are older forms, mainly because you can kind of see the evolutionary track and history of it, but there's very little of monotremes. There's a good number of marsupials. Most of them are stuck in Australia because they got stuck during Pangea breakaway, and therefore they were no longer having the different types of natural selection environmental cues, switching them into eutherians like the rest of the mammals did. And then majority of our mammals are eutherians. So that's a cladistic, and just allows us once again to see like the evolutionary history of an organism by creating these clades. All right, that is the end of chapter 14. I hope you enjoyed it, and we're going to be jumping into chapters 15 and 16 next.